There's no love quite like the bond between a man and his faithful dog, especially when that dog has been your only companion for 15 years. When Silas Boone lost his old hound Jasper last spring, he buried him with the same care he'd give family, under a hand-carved stone cross in the mountain cemetery above Dry Creek. Silas was a quiet mountain man who kept to himself, only coming to town for supplies. Months passed peacefully until one fall morning when he walked through the graveyard and stopped cold. Every grave lay brown and dead from the mountain frost. Every grave except one. Jasper's resting place was bright green, covered in thick, impossible grass. When word spread through Dry Creek about the mysterious green grave, old secrets began surfacing. What Silas discovered would shake the town to its core. But what could make one grave bloom with life while all others remained barren? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine tops like old memories as Silas Boone made his way down the winding trail from his cabin to the cemetery. At 68, his weathered hands still moved with the precision of a man who'd spent his life working stone and soil. Though the years had carved their own story across his face, deep lines around eyes that had seen too much, silver whiskers that caught the early light like frost on granite, his cabin sat perched on a rocky outcrop 800 feet above Dry Creek, accessible only by a narrow trail he'd carved himself 23 years ago when he first retreated to these mountains. The one-room structure was simple but sturdy, built from lodgepole pine and chinked with clay from the creek bed below. Inside, everything had its place. A stone fireplace that dominated one wall, shelves lined with geological surveys and well-worn books. A sturdy oak table where he took his meals alone, but it was the worn leather collar hanging from a wooden peg beside the door that truly defined the space. Jasper's collar, cracked and faded from 15 years of mountain weather and faithful service. Silas had crafted it himself from elk hide, stitching it with sinew and adding a small brass nameplate he'd hammered from an old survey marker. What few people knew, what nobody knew in fact, was that the collar contained a hidden compartment sewn into the thick leather during one sleepless night 3 years ago. Inside that compartment lay a small brass key no bigger than a man's thumb, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep it safe from the elements. The key was insurance, Silas had told himself then. Insurance against a past that kept trying to surface like groundwater after a hard rain. Jasper had been more than a companion. He'd been Silas's conscience, his early warning system, and his link to a world that often felt too harsh to face alone. The old blue-tick coonhound had arrived as a pup, traded for geological consulting work with a rancher down in the valley. From the first day, the dog had possessed an uncanny ability to read both the land and the people who crossed their path. Jasper could sense a thunderstorm 2 days out, could track a wounded deer across stone and stream, and most importantly, could judge a man's character with a single sniff. In their years together, they'd developed a rhythm that suited them both. Dawn would find them checking the weather from the cabin's front porch, Jasper's graying muzzle testing the air while Silas studied the sky. Breakfast was always shared, cornbread and coffee for the man, whatever game they'd taken the day before for the dog. Then came the day's work, maintaining the trail, tending to his small garden, or hiking the high country to collect mineral samples for the geological surveys that provided his modest income. The people of Dry Creek knew Silas as a polite but distant figure who appeared in town every 2 weeks like clockwork. He'd tie his pack mule to the hitching post outside Henley's general store, conduct his business with quiet efficiency, and disappear back into the mountains before most folks had finished their morning coffee. They respected his privacy, partly because mountain etiquette demanded it, and partly because there was something about Silas Boone that suggested a man who'd seen enough of the world to earn his solitude. What they didn't know was that Silas had once been Dr. Silas Boone, holding a doctorate in geological engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. He'd spent the first half of his life reading the earth like other men read newspapers, consulting on mining operations from Montana to Mexico. He could tell you where to dig for copper by the color of the soil, could predict a landslide from the sound of settling rock, and could map underground water sources with the kind of precision that had made him wealthy by the age of 40. But wealth had come with a price he'd never intended to pay. Sheriff Martha Hayes was one of the few people in Dry Creek who remembered when Silas first arrived. She'd been a young deputy then, fresh out of training and eager to prove herself in a county where most of the real action happened in mining camps and railroad towns 100 miles away. She remembered the day he'd walked into the sheriff's office, travel-worn and hollow-eyed, asking about land for sale in the high country, looking for something remote, he'd said in a voice that carried more than simple preference. Somewhere a man can think without interruption. Martha, now 54 and carrying the authority of 2 decades in law enforcement, had learned to read people the way Silas read rock formations. She'd seen enough broken men pass through Dry Creek to recognize the signs, the careful way Silas avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought nobody was looking, the way he positioned himself near exits. Whatever had driven Dr. Silas Boone to become plain Silas the Mountain Man, it had left marks that even 23 years of solitude hadn't completely healed. Doc Henley, who ran the general store and served as the town's unofficial keeper of gossip, had his own theories about Silas's past. A portly man in his 70s with snow-white hair and eyes that missed nothing, Doc had spent 60 years listening to the stories people told and the ones they didn't. He'd noticed the expensive surveying equipment Silas purchased, the quality of his boots and clothing, the educated way he spoke when circumstances forced conversation. That man's got education, Doc would tell his regular customers. Real education, not the kind you get from books alone. Something happened to him before he came here, something that made him choose isolation over company. Doc's grandson, Jimmy Crawford, 24 and restless in the way of young men who'd grown up in small towns, had always been fascinated by the mysterious mountain man. As a boy, he'd sometimes spot Silas's smoke rising from the high country and wonder what it would be like to live so far from everything and everyone. Now, working in his grandfather's store and dreaming of adventures beyond Dry Creek's borders, Jimmy found himself serving as the primary point of contact between Silas and the rest of the world. Every 2 weeks, Silas would appear at the store's counter with a carefully written list: coffee, flour, salt, ammunition, tobacco, and whatever seasonal items the mountains demanded. He always paid in cash, counted out exactly, and always asked about the weather forecast with the intensity of a man whose life depended on such information. Jimmy had learned to prepare Silas's order in advance, reading the patterns of his needs like a familiar recipe. It was Jimmy who first noticed the change in Silas after Jasper's death. The mountain man had always been quiet, but the loss of his companion had added a weight to his silence that seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. His orders became smaller, his visits more infrequent, and the light in his eyes, what little there had been, seemed to dim further with each passing week. The cemetery where Jasper now rested had served Dry Creek for over 50 years, though few of the original settlers remained to tend the older graves. Located on a windswept plateau halfway between town and Silas's cabin, it commanded a view of the entire valley while remaining sheltered enough to protect mourners from the worst mountain weather. The graves were marked with everything from elaborate marble headstones shipped in from Denver to simple wooden crosses carved by grieving family members. Silas had chosen a spot near the cemetery's eastern edge, close enough to the old graves to be respectful, but separate enough to mark Jasper as somehow different. He'd spent 3 days quarrying and shaping the granite cross, using tools and techniques learned during his geological career. The finished marker stood 4 feet high and bore a simple inscription: Jasper, faithful friend and true companion. Below that, He'd carved the dates of the dog's life and a small image of mountains that somehow captured both the beauty and the loneliness of their shared existence. The burial itself had been a private affair, conducted at dawn, with no witnesses except the wind and the distant cry of hawks. Silas had wrapped Jasper in his favorite blanket, the one that had warmed them both through countless winter nights, and had spoken words over the grave that he'd never shared with another living soul. He'd filled the grave carefully, marking each shovelful with the kind of attention he'd once given to geological surveys, and had finished by placing a ring of stones around the perimeter. That had been 6 months ago, in the cold grip of a late spring that had made every growing thing struggle for life. Now, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Silas found himself drawn to the cemetery more frequently than his usual weekly visits. Something about the changing season made Jasper's absence feel both more permanent and more present, if such a thing were possible. He'd taken to bringing small offerings, a piece of jerky, a wild flower, sometimes just his presence, and a few spoken words about the day's events. It was during one of these visits, on a crisp October morning, when the first frost had turned the grass silver, that Silas first noticed something unusual about Jasper's grave. While every other burial site lay dormant under autumn's brown blanket, Jasper's resting place showed a faint hint of green. At first, Silas attributed it to wishful thinking, the kind of hopeful vision that grief sometimes provides. But as days passed and the green deepened rather than faded, he was forced to admit that something extraordinary was happening. The grass growing over Jasper's grave wasn't just surviving the frost. It was thriving in defiance of every natural law Silas understood. Each morning brought new growth, deeper color, and an almost luminous quality that seemed to capture and hold the early light. By the end of the first week, the difference was unmistakable. By the end of the second, it was impossible to ignore. Word began to spread through Dry Creek, the way news always did in small mountain towns, quietly at first, then with gathering momentum as curiosity overcame skepticism. Mrs. Abernathy, who cleaned the church and tended some of the newer graves, mentioned it to Doc Henley during her weekly shopping trip. Doc shared the information with Martha Hayes during their regular coffee meeting at the diner. Martha, trained to investigate unusual occurrences, decided to see for herself. The sheriff's first visit to the cemetery confirmed everything she'd heard and raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Standing before Jasper's grave on a morning when frost had killed everything else green in the county, she found herself staring at a patch of grass so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner life. The contrast with the surrounding graves was so stark it looked artificial, as if someone had laid down a piece of carpet in the middle of a wasteland. But Martha Hayes hadn't spent 20 years in law enforcement without developing a healthy skepticism about things that seemed too strange to be true. Her first instinct was to look for practical explanations. Irrigation, fertilizer, some kind of horticultural trick that Silas might have employed out of grief-driven sentimentality. Yet even as she examined the ground for signs of tampering, she knew she wouldn't find any. The growth was too natural, too perfectly integrated with the surrounding soil, too completely at odds with the season and climate. More troubling than the mystery itself was the way it made her feel. Standing beside that impossibly green grave, Martha experienced a sensation she hadn't felt since childhood, the creeping awareness that the world contained forces beyond her understanding or control. It was the same feeling she'd had as a girl when her grandmother spoke of things that dwelt in the deep mountains, things that older generations had known enough to respect and leave undisturbed. The morning that changed everything began like any other, with Silas brewing coffee over his wood stove while dawn crept across the valley below. The ritual had become more solitary since Jasper's passing. No longer did he need to step outside to let the old hound relieve himself. No longer did he save the last piece of bacon for eager jaws and grateful eyes. The silence in his cabin had grown so complete that even the crackling of burning wood seemed intrusive. He'd planned to spend the day checking his winter preparations, ensuring his woodpile would last through the harsh months ahead, and inventorying his stores of preserved food. But as he sipped his coffee and watched the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold, an inexplicable urge drew his attention toward the cemetery. It wasn't his usual day for visiting Jasper's grave. Yet something, call it intuition or the restless stirring of a heart that had learned to listen to subtle signals, compelled him to make the walk. The trail to the cemetery wound through stands of aspen whose leaves had turned the color of old coins, creating a carpet of gold beneath his boots. October in the high country possessed a crystalline quality that made every detail sharp and immediate. The particular scent of pine resin in cold air, the way frost outlined individual blades of grass, the distant call of geese heading south in perfect formation. These were the moments when Silas felt most connected to the world around him, when the accumulated weight of his past seemed to lift just enough to let him breathe freely. But as he crested the small rise that led to the cemetery, that sense of peace shattered. Like glass against stone, the green grass covering Jasper's grave had not merely continued. Growing, it had exploded into something that defied every law of nature Silas understood. Where once there had been a patch of healthy grass, now there grew a verdant carpet, so lush and vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The grass stood nearly 6 inches tall, each blade perfect and impossibly green, as if someone had transplanted a piece of springtime paradise into the midst of autumn's death. More disturbing still were the flowers. Scattered throughout the grass, like stars in an emerald sky, bloomed tiny white flowers that Silas had never seen before, not in these mountains, not at this elevation, not in any botanical guide he'd ever studied. They were delicate things, no larger than a child's fingernail, with petals that seemed to capture and reflect the morning light in a way that made them appear almost luminescent. Silas approached the grave with the cautious steps of a man confronting something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the world. His scientific training demanded logical explanations, unusual soil composition, underground springs, some form of natural fertilization he'd overlooked. But even as his mind catalogued possible causes, his heart knew he was witnessing something that transcended the boundaries of rational explanation. Kneeling beside the grave, he extended a trembling hand toward the impossible grass. The moment his fingers made contact, a sensation like mild electricity coursed through his palm and up his arm. The grass felt real enough, cool and slightly damp with morning dew. But beneath that surface, reality lay something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was then that he noticed the smell, mixed with the clean scent of mountain air and autumn leaves. Came a fragrance so subtle and complex it took him several moments to identify. It was the smell of deep earth, but not the familiar odor of mountain soil. This was something richer, older, carrying hints of minerals and growing things from depths that had never seen sunlight. It was the smell of caves and underground rivers, of places where the earth kept its most ancient secrets. As Silas breathed in that strange fragrance, memories began stirring in the depths of his mind, memories he'd spent 23 years trying to bury as deeply as any grave. Images flickered behind his closed eyes, like photographs viewed by lightning. Dark tunnels stretching into blackness, the gleam of gold in lamplight, the face of a man whose trust he'd betrayed for reasons that had seemed so important at the time. The memories came faster now, each one carrying its own weight of guilt and regret. He saw himself at 45, standing in the office of Consolidated Mining Corporation, pointing to survey maps and explaining why the Whitmore Valley contained enough gold to make everyone involved wealthy beyond imagining. He remembered the excitement in the room, the handshakes and backslapping, the promises of percentages and partnerships that would secure his future and the futures of his children. What he'd tried to forget, what he'd come to these mountains to escape, was what happened next. The Whitmore Valley hadn't been empty land waiting for development. It had been home to a small community of farmers and ranchers who'd worked the soil for 3 generations, building lives as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. Among them had been Thomas Whitmore, the valley's unofficial leader, and the man who'd hired Silas to conduct the original geological survey for water rights and soil stability. Thomas had been a good man, the kind of person who judged others by their actions rather than their words. When he'd shaken Silas's hand and hired him to survey the valley, he'd done so based on reputation and recommendation, trusting that the renowned Dr. Boone would provide honest counsel about the land his family had called home since before the Civil War. That trust had been Thomas's fatal mistake. The survey Silas conducted had been thorough and accurate, too accurate as it turned out. The gold deposits he'd discovered were substantial enough to transform the entire region, but accessing them would require mining operations that would destroy everything the valley's residents had built. When Consolidated Mining made their initial offer to purchase the land, Thomas had refused, confident that his community's roots ran too deep to be bought and sold. That's when Silas had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of honoring his professional obligation to his client, instead of maintaining the confidentiality that Thomas had every right to expect, Silas had taken his detailed geological findings directly to Consolidated Mining. The maps he'd drawn, the soil samples he'd analyzed, the precise locations where gold could be extracted most efficiently. All of it had been handed over in exchange for a partnership agreement that promised to make him wealthy. Beyond his wildest dreams, the legal maneuvering that followed had been swift and merciless. Armed with Silas's geological data, Consolidated Mining had been able to file mineral rights claims that superseded the existing property rights of Thomas and his neighbors. Ancient laws governing subsurface mineral extraction, combined with political influence that stretched from the territorial capital to Washington, D.C., had transformed the valley's residents from landowners into trespassers on their own property. The final confrontation had taken place on a night much like this one, crisp and clear with autumn stars burning overhead. Thomas Whitmore had ridden up to Silas's temporary camp with his oldest son and 2 neighbors, determined to reason with the man he'd trusted, certain there had been some mistake or misunderstanding that could still be resolved. Silas could still see Thomas's face in the lamplight, weathered and honest, lined with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of hard work and fair dealing. He'd spoken quietly, without anger or accusation, explaining how the mining company's claims would destroy not just his family's livelihood, but the entire community that had grown up around their shared commitment to the land. "I trusted you," Thomas had said, his voice carrying more sadness than reproach. "We all did. You surveyed our land, ate at our tables, met our children. How could you do this to people who welcomed you as a friend?" Even now, 23 years later, standing beside Jasper's impossibly green grave, Silas could feel the weight of that question pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd tried to justify his actions then, speaking of legal technicalities and business necessities, explaining how the law was on Consolidated Mining's side and how resistance would only prolong the inevitable. But Thomas Whitmore hadn't been interested in legal arguments or business justifications. He'd looked Silas straight in the eye and spoken words that had echoed through every sleepless night since. A man's word should mean something. When trust dies, everything else dies with it. 3 days later, Thomas Whitmore was found dead at the bottom of a mining shaft that had been blasted into the mountainside above his family's homestead. The official investigation concluded that he'd fallen while attempting to sabotage the mining equipment. But Silas knew better. Thomas had been the kind of man who faced his problems head-on, not the kind who resorted to sabotage or violence. His death had been no accident. The mining operation had proceeded as planned, extracting millions of dollars worth of gold over the following decade, while the displaced families scattered to other territories and states, their community destroyed as thoroughly as if it had been leveled by earthquake or flood. Silas had received his promised percentage, enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But every dollar had carried the weight of Thomas Whitmore's trust and the destruction of everything the man had held dear. Now, kneeling beside Jasper's grave, with that strange, earthy fragrance filling his nostrils, Silas felt those buried memories rising like groundwater after a flood. The impossible grass beneath his fingers seemed to pulse with accusation, as if the earth itself was reminding him of debts that remained unpaid and wrongs that had never been made right. As he struggled to his feet, fighting against the emotional undertow of memories he'd thought safely buried, Silas noticed something else that made his blood run cold. At the foot of Jasper's grave, partially hidden by the luxuriant grass, lay a small object that hadn't been there during his last visit. It was a brass compass, old and tarnished, with an inscription barely visible on its worn surface. Silas picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing it immediately despite the passage of years. It was Thomas Whitmore's compass, the one he'd carried during his years as a cavalry scout before settling in the valley, the one he'd consulted constantly during their survey work together. The inscription, when Silas held it to the light, made his heart stop. To Thomas, may you always find your way home, Sarah. 1871. The compass shouldn't have been here. It couldn't have been here. Thomas Whitmore had been buried with his personal effects in the territorial cemetery near the abandoned mining camp, over 200 miles from Dry Creek. Yet here it was, placed carefully at the foot of Jasper's grave, like an offering or a message from beyond the boundary between life and death. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Silas turned the compass over and nearly dropped it in shock. Scratched into the brass backing, in letters crude but unmistakable, were the words, "The debt remains." The walk back to his cabin felt like a journey through a landscape transformed by revelation. Every familiar landmark, the lightning-split pine, the rocky outcrop where he'd often sat with Jasper, the small creek that sang its way down the mountainside, seemed charged with new meaning, as if the discovery of Thomas Whitmore's compass had rewritten the very geography of his world. Silas clutched the brass instrument in his coat pocket, its weight seeming far greater than such a small object should possess. The metal had grown warm against his palm, and more than once during the climb he'd imagined he could feel it pulsing like a living heart. Rational thought insisted such sensations were products of shock and guilt. But 23 years of mountain solitude had taught him to trust intuition over logic when circumstances pushed beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. His cabin, when he finally reached it, offered no sanctuary from the questions hammering against his consciousness. The familiar space felt alien now, as if seeing it through eyes that had been forced to acknowledge truths he'd spent decades denying. Jasper's collar still hung from its wooden peg beside the door, but now it seemed less like a memorial and more like evidence, a reminder of the secret he'd hidden even from his most faithful companion. Silas set the compass on his oak table and stared at it while his coffee grew cold in its cup. The morning light streaming through his single window caught the scratched letters on its surface, making them appear to writhe and shift like living things. The debt remains. 3 words that reduced 23 years of careful isolation to a hollow pretense. 3 words that suggested the past possessed its own terrible gravity, capable of drawing even the dead back to seek justice. His scientific mind demanded rational explanations. Someone had discovered his identity, learned about his role in the destruction of Whitmore Valley, and was now playing an elaborate game of psychological torment. But who in Dry Creek possessed such knowledge? His arrival in the mountains had been carefully orchestrated to leave no trail connecting. Dr. Silas Boone of Consolidated Mining to the hermit who'd purchased land through intermediaries and cash transactions. More. Troubling was the question of how anyone could have obtained Thomas Whitmore's personal compass. Silas had been present at the man's burial, had watched as his widow Sarah placed his cavalry sword, his Bible, and his compass in the simple pine coffin before it was lowered into territorial ground. The items had been buried with him, witnessed by nearly 50 mourners who'd gathered to pay their respects to a man whose integrity had cost him everything unless, and here Silas's geological training provided a possibility, too disturbing to fully contemplate unless someone had robbed Thomas Whitmore's grave. The thought sent him to his feet, pacing the cabin's small confines like a caged animal. Grave robbing was the province of desperate men and madmen, not the kind of calculated revenge that required decades of patience and careful planning. Yet what other explanation could account for the compass's presence? What force could have transported an object from a grave 200 miles away to a spot where its discovery would inflict maximum psychological damage? As the day wore on, Silas found himself returning again and again to examine the compass, searching for clues that might reveal its journey from Thomas's grave to Jasper's. The brass showed signs of age and weathering, but not the kind of corrosion that would be expected from nearly a quarter-century underground. If anything, it appeared to have been carefully maintained, polished and protected from the elements. The inscription on the back, "The debt remains," had been scratched with a sharp instrument, probably a knife blade, but the metal showed no signs of rust or oxidation in the grooves. The work appeared recent, certainly within the last few years, suggesting that whoever had placed the compass at Jasper's grave had been planning this moment for some time. But planning required knowledge, and knowledge required investigation. Someone had spent considerable effort learning about Silas's past, tracing his connection to Whitmore Valley, and discovering his current location. In an age before widespread communication and record-keeping, such research represented months or even years of dedicated effort. Who possessed both the motivation and the resources for such an undertaking? The obvious answer was someone connected to the Whitmore family or the other displaced residents of the valley. Thomas had left behind a widow and 3 children, along with dozens of neighbors and friends whose lives had been shattered by the mining operation. Any one of them might harbor sufficient hatred to justify elaborate revenge, but that still didn't explain how they'd located him or obtained access to Thomas's personal effects. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across his cabin floor, Silas made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He retrieved Jasper's collar from its peg and worked his fingers along the hidden seam until he found the small brass key wrapped in oiled cloth. The key had been his insurance policy, his safeguard against a day he'd hoped would never come, the day when his past finally tracked him to his mountain refuge. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's northeast corner lay a metal strongbox that contained the documents Silas had hoped never to need again. His real name, his professional credentials, correspondence from Consolidated Mining, and most importantly, a detailed map showing the location of every significant gold deposit in Whitmore Valley. The map represented both his greatest professional achievement and his most damning piece of evidence, proof of the geological survey that had made the mining operation possible and the betrayal that had destroyed Thomas Whitmore's life. The key turned easily in the strongbox's lock, and Silas lifted the lid with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. The documents lay exactly as he'd left them, wrapped in oiled canvas and tied with leather cord. But as he reached for the bundle, his fingers encountered something that shouldn't have been there, a small leather journal. Bound in cracked brown hide and secured with a rawhide thong, Silas lifted the journal with growing dread, recognizing it even before he opened the cover. It was Thomas Whitmore's survey notebook, the one he'd carried during their weeks of geological work together. The one in which he'd recorded observations about soil composition, water sources, and mineral indicators. Silas had seen Thomas writing in it countless times, updating his records with the methodical precision of a man who understood that accurate information was the foundation of sound decisions. The journal's presence in his strongbox was impossible. He'd never taken it, never even handled it, except when Thomas had shown him specific entries relevant to their survey work. Like the compass, it should have been buried with its owner, yet here it was. somehow transported across hundreds of miles and decades of time to confront him with physical evidence of his betrayal. With growing trepidation, Silas opened the journal's cover and began reading entries written in Thomas's careful script. The early pages contained routine observations about weather, soil conditions, and water flow, the mundane details that formed the backbone of successful farming and ranching. But as he turned the pages, the entries began taking on a different character, recording suspicions and concerns that chilled. Silas to the bone, Dr. Boone spent considerable time today examining the creek bed upstream from the Peterson place, read one. Entry dated 3 weeks into their survey. His interest seemed focused on mineral deposits rather than water rights, despite our stated purpose. When questioned, he provided explanations that seemed evasive and incomplete. Another entry, written a week later, was even more damning. Found Dr. Boone taking rock samples from the North Ridge without permission or explanation. His behavior suggests interests beyond those outlined in our agreement. Beginning to question his true intentions, the final entries, written in the days before Thomas's death, revealed a man who'd recognized the threat too late to prevent its consequences. Have discovered that Dr. Boone has been in communication with representatives of Consolidated Mining Corporation. Fear we have been deceived about the true purpose of his survey. Must confront him directly and demand explanation. The journal's last entry, dated the morning of Thomas's death, consisted of a single line that struck Silas like a physical blow. A man who betrays trust betrays everything. Some debts follow a man beyond the grave. As Silas closed the journal, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control them, he noticed a loose piece of paper tucked between the back cover and the final page. When he unfolded it, he found a hand-drawn map showing the location of something marked only as TW, Final Rest, True Location. The map depicted an area Silas didn't immediately recognize, showing geographical features that seemed familiar yet somehow displaced. Mountain peaks, creek beds, and rock formations were sketched with the kind of precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. But the overall layout didn't match any location he could identify from his years in the Dry Creek region. At the bottom of the map, written in the same careful script as the journal entries, was a message that made his blood run cold. The truth lies where the earth remembers. Find the real grave if you would settle the debt. Outside his cabin window, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that reminded Silas uncomfortably of fire and blood. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the gathering darkness, and the sound seemed to echo the isolation that had suddenly become his prison rather than his refuge. The compass and journal lay before him on the table like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve, evidence of a past that refused to stay buried, and a debt that apparently transcended the boundaries between life and death. Whatever force had brought these artifacts to his attention clearly wasn't finished with him yet, and Silas found himself wondering if 23 years of peace had been merely a pause before the final reckoning he'd always known must come. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams that felt more like memories, and memories that carried the weight of prophecy. Silas found himself walking through landscapes that shifted between the familiar contours of Dry Creek and the lost geography of Whitmore Valley, pursuing a figure that remained always just beyond the edge of vision. In these dreams, Jasper ran beside him as he had in life. But the dog's eyes held an intelligence and purpose that transcended mere animal loyalty. When dawn finally arrived, grey and cold, with the promise of early snow, Silas felt as though he'd aged years in a single night. The compass and journal still lay on his table where he'd left them, their presence no less disturbing in morning light than they'd been in the shadows of evening. If anything, daylight made their impossibility more acute, stripping away the protective veil of darkness that might have suggested hallucination or dream. He forced himself through his morning routine: coffee, A breakfast of cornbread and honey, the ritual checking of weather signs that had governed his mountain life for over 2 decades. But each familiar action felt hollow now, performed by a man going through motions while his mind grappled with questions that had no rational answers. The normalcy he'd cultivated so carefully seemed as fragile as frost on window glass, ready to shatter at the first touch of truth. It was while sipping his second cup of coffee that Silas heard the sound of approaching horses. Visitors to his mountain retreat were rare enough to be noteworthy, and the steady rhythm of multiple animals suggested official business rather than casual call. Through his cabin window, he watched Sheriff Martha Hayes emerge from the tree line, leading a small party that included Doc Henley and young Jimmy. Crawford, the sheriff's expression as she approached. The cabin carried the kind of professional neutrality that Silas recognized from his encounters with law enforcement during the Whitmore Valley investigation. It was the face of someone who'd come seeking answers to questions they weren't entirely comfortable asking. The look of authority confronting circumstances that stretched beyond normal experience. Morning. "Silas!" Martha called as she dismounted, her voice carrying the careful courtesy that marked serious conversations in mountain communities. "Hope you don't mind the early visit, but we need to have a talk about what's been happening up at the cemetery." Silas stepped onto his porch, acutely aware of the compass and journal hidden just inside his cabin door. "Sheriff, Doc, Jimmy," he nodded to each visitor in turn, noting the mix of curiosity and concern in their faces. "Coffee's fresh, if you're interested." "Much obliged," Martha replied, but her attention was already focused on reading Silas's demeanor with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to detect deception in all its forms. "Had some interesting reports about your dog's grave. Thought you might have some insights about what's causing the unusual growth." Doc Henley, whose age and position in the community gave him license to speak directly, cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Silas, that grass is growing like nothing anyone's ever seen. Jimmy here's been asking questions, and what we're hearing doesn't make much sense from a natural standpoint." Jimmy Crawford, normally tongue-tied in the presence of the mysterious mountain man, found his voice emboldened by the strange circumstances. "Mr. Boone, I've been reading about soil composition and plant growth, trying to understand what might cause such unusual conditions. Nothing in the agricultural journals explains grass growing that thick and green this late in the season, especially with the frost we've been having." Silas studied the 3 faces before him, recognizing in their expressions the same mixture of skepticism and wonder he'd felt when first confronting the impossible green grave. These were practical people, grounded in the realities of mountain life, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. If they'd come seeking explanations, it meant the mystery had grown beyond what their rational minds could comfortably dismiss. "I've noticed the unusual growth," Silas admitted carefully. "Been trying to make sense of it myself. Jasper was buried in good soil, and I've been tending the grave regular-like, but nothing I've done should account for what we're seeing." Martha's eyes sharpened at something in his tone. "Been tending the grave how exactly? Any special treatment, fertilizers, anything that might explain the difference?" The question carried undertones that made Silas realize the sheriff suspected deliberate intervention rather than natural phenomena. It was a reasonable assumption, easier to believe in human agency than in forces that operated outside the boundaries of understood science. But as he considered how to respond, Silas found himself facing a choice between partial truth and complete deception. "Just regular care," he said finally, keeping the weeds clear, placing a few stones around the perimeter. "Nothing that would account for grass like that." Doc Henley stepped closer to the porch, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that spoke to deeper mysteries. "Silas, there's something else. Mrs. Peterson claims she saw lights up around the cemetery 3 nights ago. Strange lights," she said, like nothing she'd ever seen before. "Dancing around the graves like spirits or some such nonsense." The mention of lights sent an unexpected chill down Silas's spine. Mrs. Peterson lived in a cabin about 2 miles from the cemetery, positioned where she could see the burial ground from her kitchen window. She was known for her practical nature and her reluctance to engage in gossip or speculation, making her report all the more credible. "What kind of lights?" Silas asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Jimmy pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket, consulting notes he'd apparently taken during his investigation. She described them as blue-green, about the size of lantern flames, moving in patterns around the graves. Said they seemed to be concentrated around the eastern section, where your dog is buried. The description matched details from geological phenomena Silas had encountered during his professional career, the kind of phosphorescent effects sometimes seen around mineral deposits or underground gas seepage. But such effects required specific geological conditions that simply didn't exist in the Dry Creek area. And they certainly didn't explain the selective nature of the manifestation around Jasper's grave alone. Martha had been studying Silas's reactions throughout the conversation, and now she stepped forward with the directness that had made her an effective sheriff. "Silas, I need to ask if there's anything about your past that might be relevant to what's happening. Sometimes these kinds of unusual events have explanations that go back further than we initially think to look." The question hit closer to home than Martha could have known, forcing Silas to confront the possibility that his past had somehow followed him to Dry Creek, despite his careful efforts to disappear. But admitting any connection between current events and his history with Whitmore Valley would require explanations. He wasn't prepared to give explanations that might incriminate him in ways that went far beyond mysterious botanical phenomena. "My past is quiet enough," he said, the words carrying just enough truth to avoid outright deception. "Nothing that would account for what we're seeing at the cemetery." But even as he spoke, Silas was thinking about the compass and journal hidden in his cabin, artifacts that suggested his past was anything but quiet, and that the events at Jasper's grave might be connected to debts he'd thought safely buried with their creditors. Doc Henley cleared his throat, a sound that in mountain communities often preceded the sharing of difficult truths. "Silas, there's one more thing you should know. Word's been spreading beyond Dry Creek about the unusual grave. Had a visitor yesterday asking questions about you specifically. Fellow claimed to be a journalist researching unusual phenomena. But something about him didn't sit right. The news hit Silas like a physical blow. A journalist asking specific questions about him suggested that someone had connected his current identity with his professional past, despite the years and precautions he'd taken to cover his tracks. It meant the careful anonymity he'd constructed was beginning to crumble, exposing him to scrutiny that could uncover secrets far more damaging than unexplained botanical growth. "What kind of questions?" Silas asked, working to keep his voice steady. Despite the alarm bells ringing in his head, Jimmy consulted his notes again. "Wanted to know about your background, how long you'd been in the area, whether you'd ever worked in mining or geological surveying. Grandfather told him we minded our own business in Dry Creek and suggested he do the same." But the fellow seemed mighty persistent. The description of the stranger's interests left no doubt in Silas's mind. Someone had connected Dr. Silas Boone of Consolidated Mining with the hermit of Dry Creek. Whether that someone was the mysterious journalist or the force behind the compass and journal, it meant his 23 years of peaceful isolation were coming to an end. Martha stepped back toward her horse, but her eyes remained fixed on Silas with the intensity of someone who sensed important information being withheld. "If you think of anything that might help explain what's happening, you know where to find me." These kinds of mysteries have a way of growing if they're not addressed directly. As the three visitors mounted their horses and disappeared back into the forest, Silas stood on his porch, feeling the weight of walls closing in around him. The compass and journal waited inside his cabin, like accusers demanding justice, while somewhere beyond the mountains, forces he didn't understand were gathering to confront him with consequences he'd spent decades trying to avoid. The green grave was no longer just a mystery. It was a beacon, drawing attention to secrets that had been buried too long and debts that remained unpaid despite the passage of years. Whatever Thomas Whitmore had meant by his final journal entry about debts following a man beyond the grave, Silas was beginning to understand that some reckonings couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The storm he'd felt building in the mountain air seemed to be gathering inside his own heart, and he knew that soon he would have to choose between continuing to run from his past or finally turning to face the ghosts that had followed him to this high country refuge. The stranger arrived in Dry Creek 2 days after Sheriff Hayes's visit, riding a dust-covered horse that spoke of long miles and hard travel. He checked into the small boarding house that Mrs. Fletcher ran above the general store, paying for a week's lodging with gold coins that caught the afternoon light like captured fire. His name, according to the register, was Samuel Morrison, and he claimed to represent a Denver newspaper investigating unusual phenomena in the Colorado Territory. But Jimmy Crawford, whose curiosity had been sharpened by recent events, noticed details that didn't align with the man's stated profession. Morrison's hands bore the calluses of someone accustomed to hard physical labor rather than the soft palms of a writer. His boots were crafted for rough terrain, and his coat showed the kind of wear that came from years of outdoor work rather than occasional travel. Most telling of all were his eyes, pale blue and constantly moving, taking in details with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in observation and assessment. Doc Henley, whose decades in the mercantile business had taught him to read people like ledger books, found himself troubled by Morrison's presence from their first encounter. The stranger's questions about Silas Boone seemed too specific, too focused on details that a casual journalist shouldn't have known to ask about. When Morrison inquired about Silas's geological background and his possible connection to mining operations, Doc's suspicions hardened into certainty that this was no ordinary newspaperman. Been asking mighty particular questions about our mountain friend? Doc confided to Martha Hayes during their regular coffee meeting at the diner. Questions that suggest he knows more about Silas than he's letting on. Makes a man wonder what kind of past someone might be running from to end up living alone in the high country. Martha had been having similar thoughts, her law enforcement instincts triggered by the convergence of Morrison's arrival with the strange events at the cemetery. In her experience, coincidences were rare and usually pointed toward connections that weren't immediately apparent. The timing suggested that Morrison's interest in Silas might be related to the mysterious phenomena surrounding Jasper's grave. "What do you make of those gold coins he's paying with?" Martha asked, stirring her coffee with the deliberate motions of someone working through a complex problem. Not many newspaper writers carry that kind of wealth, especially not in coins that old. Jimmy, who'd been listening from the counter where he was stacking supplies, turned with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. "I got a look at one of those coins when he was paying for tobacco. It's territorial gold, minted back in the 60s. The kind of money that came out of the big mining operations before statehood. The significance of territorial gold wasn't lost on any of them. Such coins had become rare, held mainly by people who'd profited from the mining boom that had transformed the Colorado Territory. In the decades following the Civil War, for Morrison to be carrying such wealth suggested connections to the kind of mining interests that had shaped the region's history, and possibly to the same forces that had driven men like Silas Boone to seek refuge in remote mountain retreats. Meanwhile, up in his cabin, Silas was discovering that isolation provided no protection from memories that had begun asserting themselves with increasing force. Sleep brought dreams of Whitmore Valley as it had been before the mining operation. Green pastures where cattle grazed, farmhouses that echoed with children's laughter, a community that had flourished for 3 generations before his betrayal destroyed it in a matter of months. But the dreams were changing, becoming more vivid and detailed than simple memories should allow. In them, He walked through the valley as it existed now, a wasteland of abandoned mining equipment and poisoned streams, where nothing grew and no wildlife remained. The houses had been torn down or burned, their foundations scattered like broken teeth across land that could no longer support life. Most disturbing were the figures he encountered in these dreams. Thomas Whitmore walked among the ruins, his face bearing the patient expression of a man who'd found purpose in death that had eluded him in life. Sometimes he was accompanied by others, displaced families, neighbors who'd lost everything, children who'd grown up in exile because of decisions made in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. They never spoke directly to Silas in these dreams, but their presence carried a weight of accusation that felt more real than waking consciousness. It was as if his sleeping mind had become a courtroom where the dead could finally confront their betrayer, where justice delayed could finally demand its due. The compass had begun affecting him even when he wasn't touching it. Silas found himself drawn to check its location multiple times each day, as if afraid it might disappear as mysteriously as it had arrived. But instead of vanishing, it seemed to be growing more substantial, its brass surface becoming brighter and its needle more active. The instrument that should have pointed steadily north now swung in patterns that suggested it was responding to influences beyond simple magnetism. Thomas Whitmore's journal proved equally unsettling. Silas had read it cover to cover multiple times, memorizing entries that painted a picture of growing suspicion and ultimate betrayal. But new details seemed to emerge with each reading, subtle observations about soil composition and mineral indicators that revealed how thoroughly Thomas had understood the true value of his land, even as he'd trusted Silas to keep that knowledge confidential. The final entry, about debts following a man beyond the grave, had begun to feel less like metaphor and more like literal prophecy. Each day brought new evidence that forces beyond his understanding were working to drag his buried past into the light of present consequences. It was on the third day after Morrison's arrival that Silas made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. The hand-drawn map found in Thomas's journal had been calling to him with increasing insistence. Its cryptic notations about TW final rest, true location, suggesting answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. If supernatural forces were indeed bringing artifacts from Thomas's grave to confront him, then perhaps the real grave held keys to understanding and possibly ending the haunting that had transformed his peaceful refuge into a prison of guilt and fear. The map depicted terrain that seemed familiar yet displaced, as if someone had taken geographical features from the Dry Creek region and rearranged them according to logic that transcended simple topography. Mountain peaks corresponded roughly to landmarks Silas recognized, but their relationships to each other suggested hidden connections that normal surveying wouldn't reveal. More intriguing were the symbols scattered across the map, small marks that resembled geological survey, notations but seemed to indicate something other than mineral deposits or water sources. They clustered around the area marked as Thomas's true location, suggesting that whatever lay there possessed significance beyond a simple burial site. Silas spent hours studying the map, applying the geological expertise that had once made him wealthy and respected. Gradually, patterns emerged that suggested the marked location might be accessible from Dry Creek, though reaching it would require knowledge of terrain that didn't appear on any official survey. It was as if Thomas had discovered or been shown pathways through the mountains that existed outside normal geographical understanding. The decision to follow the map carried risks that extended far beyond physical danger. If Morrison was indeed connected to forces investigating Silas's past, leaving his cabin for an extended expedition might provide opportunities for search or surveillance that could expose secrets he'd protected for over 2 decades. But the alternative, remaining passive while supernatural forces continued their campaign of psychological warfare, seemed equally dangerous. As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of another night filled with guilty dreams and impossible visions. Silas began preparing for a journey that might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted him since Thomas Whitmore's death. The compass and journal went into his pack, along with supplies for several days in the wilderness, while the map remained spread on his table like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Outside his cabin window, the first snow of the season began falling in large, soft flakes that caught the last light like fragments of peace descending from a troubled sky. But Silas knew that peace would remain elusive until he'd confronted whatever truth lay buried in the location marked on Thomas's mysterious map, truth that might finally explain why the dead refused to stay silent and why some debts transcended the boundaries. Between life and death, the green grave had been just the beginning, a sign pointing toward revelations that would either destroy him or set him free. Tomorrow, he would begin following that sign wherever it might lead, even if the path took him straight into the heart of mysteries that challenged everything he thought he understood about justice, redemption, and the price of betrayal. Dawn found Silas standing at the edge of his familiar world, pack secured and rifle slung across his shoulder, studying the terrain that stretched beyond the boundaries of everything he'd called home for 23 years. The map in his breast pocket seemed to pulse with its own warmth, as if the paper itself was alive with purpose and direction. Behind him, his cabin sat shuttered and silent, waiting for a return that felt far from certain. The first landmark indicated on Thomas's map lay 3 miles northeast of his usual territory, in a section of mountainous terrain he'd always avoided without quite understanding why. As Silas began his descent into unfamiliar valleys, he found himself walking through landscape that felt simultaneously foreign and deeply known, as if his feet remembered paths his conscious mind had never traveled. The snow had continued falling through the night, laying a blanket of white across the high country that made tracking both easier and more dangerous. His own footprints would be clearly visible to anyone who might follow, but the same snow would reveal if he was being pursued. Every few hundred yards, Silas paused to scan the terrain behind him, searching for signs of movement that might indicate Morrison or other interested parties had discovered his departure. What he found instead was something far more unsettling. The snow around Jasper's grave, visible from several points along his route, continued to show the impossible green growth that had started the entire mystery. But now, in the clear light of morning and the stark contrast provided by fresh snow, Silas could see that the green area was expanding. What had begun as a patch the size of the grave itself now covered a circle nearly 20 feet in diameter, as if whatever force was causing the phenomenon was gaining strength rather than fading with time. More disturbing still were the tracks he discovered as he descended into the valley marked on Thomas's map. Mixed among the normal signs of deer, elk, and smaller mountain creatures were prints that defied easy identification. They appeared to be human footprints, but of a size and depth that suggested someone far larger and heavier than any person Silas had ever encountered. The tracks moved in purposeful lines across the landscape, converging on the area where Thomas's map indicated his true resting place might be found. The valley itself, when Silas finally reached it, proved to be a place that geography seemed to have forgotten. Sheltered on 3 sides by towering peaks that blocked both wind and easy access, it contained features that shouldn't have existed at this elevation. Stands of trees that remained green despite the season, streams that ran warm enough to keep ice from forming, and soil that showed signs of mineral content unlike anything in the surrounding region. At the valley's heart, exactly where Thomas's map had indicated, Silas discovered something that stopped him in his tracks. Rising from a natural clearing was a structure that seemed to bridge the gap between human construction and natural formation. A pyramid of carefully fitted stones that stood nearly 15 feet high, its surface weathered by years, but clearly showing signs of deliberate design and construction. The pyramid was built from granite blocks that must have weighed several tons each, fitted together with the kind of precision that required both engineering knowledge and considerable physical capability. No mortar held the stones together, yet they formed a structure so solid and perfectly balanced that not even the mountain's frequent earthquakes had been able to shift them from their intended positions. But it was what surrounded the pyramid that truly captured Silas's attention and filled him with a mixture of awe and dread. The entire clearing was covered with the same impossible green growth that had appeared over Jasper's grave, but here it grew in patterns that suggested intelligence and intention. Geometric designs spiraled outward from the pyramid's base, creating mandalas of living grass that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, carved into the pyramid's eastern face, where the morning sun would strike it first, was an inscription that made Silas's hands shake as he read, "Here lies the truth that money cannot bury. Here rests the justice that corruption cannot silence. Here, Thomas Whitmore waits for those who would make amends for wrongs that transcend the grave." Below the inscription, set into a niche that seemed designed specifically for the purpose, was a brass plate bearing a familiar name and dates. But these weren't the dates that marked Thomas Whitmore's birth and death. They were dates that chronicled the destruction of Whitmore Valley. From the day Silas had begun his geological survey to the day the last family had been forced to abandon their ancestral home. As Silas approached the pyramid, the compass in his pack began to vibrate with increasing intensity, as if responding to magnetic forces emanating from the structure itself. When he removed the instrument, its needle spun wildly for several moments before locking onto the pyramid with such force that the entire compass seemed to pull toward the stone monument. The journal, too, seemed to be reacting to their proximity to this impossible place. When Silas opened it, he found that new entries had appeared. Pages that had been blank the previous evening now bore writing in Thomas's familiar script. But these words had never been written by living hands. They were messages from beyond death, communications that bridged the gap between the world of the living and whatever realm claimed the souls of the betrayed. "The earth remembers what men choose to forget," read one entry. "Every lie told for profit, every trust broken for gain, every life destroyed by greed, all of it is recorded in stone and soil, in the deep places where truth cannot be corrupted by those who profit from deception." Another passage struck even deeper. "You stand now at the place where justice waits for those with courage enough to face what they have done. The debt can be paid, but only by one who acknowledges the full cost of his actions and commits himself to undoing the harm he has caused." As Silas read these impossible words, he became aware that he was no longer alone in the clearing. Figures were emerging from the forest around the pyramid, not the physical presence of living people, but something far more profound and unsettling. They appeared as suggestions of human form, translucent and shifting, but recognizable nonetheless as the faces of those he'd betrayed in Whitmore Valley. Thomas Whitmore himself materialized at the pyramid's base, not as the broken man who died at the bottom of a mining shaft, but as the proud farmer and community leader he'd been before Silas's betrayal had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. His presence carried no anger or hatred, but rather a profound sadness that spoke to opportunities lost and truths denied. "You came," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the clearing like wind through autumn leaves. "I wondered if guilt alone would be enough to bring you to this place, or if it would take the evidence of your own eyes to convince you that some debts cannot be escaped through distance or time." Silas found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand how any of this is possible. You're dead. I saw you buried." Thomas's expression carried a patience that transcended human understanding. "Death is not the ending you believed it to be. For those who die with unfinished business, with wrongs that demand correction and truths that require telling, the grave is merely a way station rather than a final destination." Around the clearing, other figures began to take more solid form. Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's widow, holding the hands of children who'd grown up in exile, neighbors whose farms had been destroyed to make room for mining equipment, elderly people who died in poverty after losing everything they'd worked a lifetime to build. "We are not here for revenge," Thomas continued, gesturing to the assembled spirits of the displaced and destroyed. "Revenge is a luxury of the living, and we have moved beyond such concerns. We are here because the truth must finally be told, because justice delayed is not justice denied, and because the harm you helped to cause continues to spread like poison through the living world." Silas looked around the clearing, taking in the impossible sight of the dead gathered to confront him with consequences he'd spent decades trying to avoid. "What do you want from me? What can I possibly do now to change what happened 23 years ago?" Thomas stepped closer to the pyramid, his hand resting on the carved stone as if drawing strength from its ancient solidity. "The gold that was taken from our valley, the wealth that was built on our destruction, it was never truly yours to keep. Money stolen through betrayal carries its own curse, and that curse has been growing stronger with each passing year. The mining company paid me a legitimate fee for my geological services," Silas protested, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Legitimate. Thomas's voice carried a weight of irony that seemed to echo from the stone itself. "You speak of legitimacy to those whose legitimate claims to their ancestral land were swept aside by your expert testimony about mineral rights and corporate interests. You provided the technical justification that allowed powerful men to steal everything we had built over 3 generations. Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, her presence somehow more substantial than the others, as if her grief had given her additional power to bridge the gap between worlds. "Do you know what happened to our children after you helped destroy our home? Do you know how many died in exile? How many never lived to see adulthood because they were driven from the only place they'd ever known?" The question hit Silas with physical force, reminding him of aspects of his betrayal he'd never allowed himself to consider. In his focus on the immediate consequences, Thomas's death, the legal maneuvering, his own flight from the aftermath, he'd never thought about the long-term effects on the displaced families, the children who'd been torn from their roots and scattered across an unforgiving frontier. "I didn't know," he whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning his throat like acid. "I never thought about what would happen to the families afterward. That," Thomas said with the finality of judgment rendered, "is precisely the problem. You never thought about the human cost of your actions because it was easier to see gold than to see people. But the earth remembers everything, and now it demands an accounting that goes beyond what any earthly court could provide." As Thomas Whitmore's words echoed across the impossible clearing, Silas felt the weight of 23 years of denial finally cracking under the pressure of absolute truth. But even as he prepared to accept whatever judgment these spirits might render, a new voice cut through the supernatural dialogue, a voice that belonged unmistakably to the living world. Well, Dr. Silas Boone, I presume." Silas spun toward the sound, his heart hammering as Samuel Morrison emerged from the tree line with the confident stride of a man who'd found exactly what he'd been seeking. But Morrison's appearance in this place of spirits and impossible phenomena seemed to cause a shift in the supernatural gathering. The translucent figures of the dead became more solid, more present, as if his arrival had somehow strengthened their ability to manifest in the physical world. "You're not a journalist," Silas said, the statement carrying the weight of certainty rather than question. Morrison laughed, a sound that held no humor. "No, I'm not. Though I have been researching a story for quite some time, the story of what really happened in Whitmore Valley, and what became of the man whose expert testimony made the destruction possible." As Morrison moved closer to the pyramid, Silas noticed something that made his blood run cold. The stranger's shadow fell across the carved inscription, but instead of blocking the letters, it seemed to make them glow brighter, as if his presence was somehow feeding energy into the supernatural forces at work in this place. "My name," Morrison continued, "is Samuel Whitmore Morrison. Thomas Whitmore was my grandfather. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything he thought he understood about the recent events. Morrison wasn't a random investigator or supernatural force. He was family, the grandson of the man whose betrayal had haunted Silas for over 2 decades. Thomas's spirit, rather than fading at his grandson's arrival, seemed to grow more substantial. Samuel has spent 15 years searching for you, following a trail that led from Denver to mining camps across 3 territories. He found me first, you see. Found my real grave, the one where my spirit finally came to rest after the mining company's cemetery was flooded by their operations. Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that Silas recognized with growing horror. I found grandfather's real burial site 3 years ago, along with documents he'd hidden before his death. Documents that tell a very different story than the one Consolidated Mining told the territorial authorities. As Morrison opened the portfolio, the assembled spirits pressed closer, their forms becoming so solid that Silas could see individual details. The calloused hands that spoke of lives spent in honest labor, the eyes that held the particular sadness of people who'd lost everything to forces beyond their control. It seems my grandfather suspected what you were planning even before you made your deal with the mining company, Morrison continued, spreading papers across the pyramid's base. He kept detailed records of your conversations, your questions, the particular interest you showed in areas that had nothing to do with the water rights survey he'd hired you to conduct. The papers Morrison displayed included copies of correspondence between Silas and Consolidated Mining, letters that predated the official completion of his geological survey by several weeks. The letters detailed specific locations where gold could be extracted most efficiently, along with recommendations for the most cost-effective methods of removing the current residents from their land. But that's not the most interesting thing he discovered, Morrison said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Tell him, grandfather. Tell him what you learned about his previous work with the mining company. Thomas's spirit moved to stand beside his grandson, the family resemblance now clear in their shared expressions of determined justice. You weren't brought to Whitmore Valley by chance, Silas. Consolidated Mining had been planning the operation for over 2 years, waiting for the right expert to provide the geological justification they needed to override our property rights. What he's saying, Morrison added, is that you weren't hired to conduct an honest survey. You were hired specifically because your previous work had demonstrated a willingness to alter geological findings in exchange for financial compensation. The accusation struck deeper than anything the spirits had revealed, because it touched on a pattern of behavior Silas had never admitted, even to himself. The Whitmore Valley survey hadn't been his first compromise with professional ethics. It had been merely the largest and most devastating in a series of decisions that prioritized profit over integrity. The Clearwater Canyon project, Morrison continued, consulting another document from his portfolio. The Broken Bow mining operation, the Silver Creek Territorial Survey. In each case, you provided geological reports that supported mining interests at the expense of existing communities. And in each case, you received compensation far exceeding normal consulting fees. As Morrison detailed the pattern of Silas's professional corruption, the spirits around the clearing began to change. What had been recognizable human forms started to shift and multiply, revealing the true scope of communities that had been destroyed by his expert testimony. Faces appeared that Silas had never seen before, families from mining operations he'd barely remembered, children whose lives had been disrupted by decisions he'd made in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. You weren't just a geologist who made one terrible mistake, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. You were a man who made betrayal into a profession, who turned your expertise into a weapon that powerful interests could use against people who had no way to defend themselves. The revelation shattered the last of Silas's self-deception. forcing him to confront the truth about his professional career and the man he'd chosen to become. Whitmore Valley hadn't been an aberration. It had been the culmination of a pattern that stretched back nearly a decade before Thomas Whitmore's death. But Morrison wasn't finished. From his portfolio, he withdrew a final document that made Silas's legs buckle with shock and recognition. It was a geological survey map drawn in his own hand, showing the mineral deposits that lay beneath the land where his cabin now stood. Did you think it was coincidence that brought you to this particular section of the Colorado mountains? Morrison asked, his voice carrying a terrible gentleness. Did you think it was random chance that led you to purchase land that happens to sit on top of one of the richest gold deposits in the territory? Silas stared at the map, his mind reeling as he recognized details he'd forgotten, the precision of the geological notations, the specific identification of mineral veins that ran beneath what would later become his refuge from the consequences of his actions. You surveyed this land 15 years before you came here, Thomas's spirit said. Surveyed it for consolidated mining as part of their long-term acquisition strategy. They planned to wait until territorial status was achieved and property laws became more favorable to large-scale mining operations. The implications crashed over Silas like an avalanche. His mountain retreat, his 23 years of supposed isolation and penance, had been built quite literally on top of the wealth he'd helped steal from communities like Whitmore Valley. Even his attempt to escape his past had been unconsciously guided by the same greed that had motivated his original betrayal. Morrison stepped closer, his pale eyes reflecting the strange light that seemed to emanate from the pyramid itself. But here's the thing, Dr. Boone, or should I say Mr. Silas, the gold beneath your cabin isn't actually yours. According to territorial law and the original land grants, mineral rights in this area belong to the federal government unless specifically transferred through proper channels. What are you saying? Silas whispered, though part of him already understood. I'm saying that your legal claim to this land is based on fraudulent documentation, Morrison replied, producing another set of papers. Documentation that I've spent 3 years proving was falsified by the same company that destroyed my grandfather's community. Thomas's spirit moved to stand directly before Silas, his presence so solid now that it seemed to cast its own shadow. The debt you owe cannot be paid with gold that was never rightfully yours. The only currency that matters now is truth, complete, uncompromising truth about everything you've done and everyone you've helped to destroy. Around the clearing, the assembled spirits of the displaced and destroyed began to fade slightly, but their voices grew stronger, creating a chorus that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Truth, justice, acknowledgement, restitution. Morrison closed his portfolio and fixed Silas with a stare that carried the accumulated weight of 15 years of investigation and family grief. Tomorrow morning, representatives from the territorial government will arrive in Dry Creek with documentation, proving that your land claims are invalid and that you've been living illegally on federal property for over 2 decades. But that's not all, he continued, his voice growing harder. They'll also be carrying warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the wrongful deaths that resulted from the mining operations you helped to facilitate. The supernatural manifestation that had brought Silas to this place suddenly revealed its true purpose. It hadn't been about supernatural justice or ghostly revenge. It had been about creating the circumstances that would finally bring him face to face with earthly consequences he'd evaded for far too long. As the truth of his situation settled over him like a shroud, Silas realized that the green grass growing over Jasper's grave had been more than a supernatural phenomenon. It had been a beacon, designed to draw attention to mysteries that would ultimately expose secrets he'd thought safely buried. The spirits around the clearing began to fade as the sun reached its zenith. But Thomas's presence remained strong enough for final words that would echo in Silas's memory long after the supernatural gathering had dissolved. "You have one choice remaining," Thomas said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment rendered. "You can attempt to run again, spending whatever time remains to you as a fugitive from justice you helped to delay. Or you can choose to face what you've done, to tell the complete truth about your role in destroying communities across the territory, and to spend your remaining years working to undo some of the harm you've caused." As the spirits faded into memory, and the impossible clearing returned to something approaching normal mountain landscape, Silas found himself alone with Morrison, and a decision that would determine not just his immediate future, but the ultimate meaning of a life that had been built on betrayal and sustained by denial. The green grass beneath the pyramid continued to pulse with its own inner light, waiting for his choice. The journey back to his cabin felt like walking through the landscape of his own judgment, each familiar landmark now carrying the weight of revelations that had stripped away every comfortable delusion he'd nurtured for over 2 decades. Morrison had departed for Dry Creek to await the arrival of territorial authorities, leaving Silas alone with the compass, the journal, and a decision that would determine whether his remaining years would be spent as a fugitive or as a man, finally willing to face the consequences of his choices. The sun was setting behind the western peaks as Silas climbed the familiar trail to his mountain retreat, painting the sky in shades that reminded him uncomfortably of blood and fire. Behind him, the pyramid and its impossible clearing seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the confrontation with Thomas's spirit had charged the very air with possibilities that transcended the boundaries between justice and redemption. His cabin, when he finally reached it, felt like a museum dedicated to a life built on lies. Every object within its walls, the surveying equipment that had made his betrayals possible, the books that had taught him to read the earth's secrets, the simple furnishings that had provided comfort during his years of supposed penance, now seemed tainted by the knowledge of how his presence in this place had been guided by unconscious greed rather than conscious repentance. But it was Jasper's collar, still hanging from its wooden peg beside the door, that struck him with the most profound sense of loss. The hidden compartment that contained the brass key had been his insurance against discovery, his safeguard against the day when his past might catch up with him. Now that day had arrived, and the key seemed less like protection and more like evidence of his fundamental inability to trust even his most faithful companion with the truth about who he really was. As darkness settled over the high country, Silas found himself at his oak table, the compass and journal spread before him like the instruments of his own judgment. The territorial authorities would arrive tomorrow, bringing with them questions he'd avoided for 23 years, and consequences he'd traveled across half a continent to escape. But for tonight, he had the silence of the mountains and the weight of memory to help him decide what kind of man he wanted to be in whatever time remained. The compass needle, which had spun wildly during their visit to the pyramid, now pointed steadily in a direction that wasn't quite north, toward Dry Creek and the reckoning that awaited him there. The journal lay open to pages that had been blank that morning, but now contained entries written in his own hand, though he had no memory of writing them. "A man's life is measured not by the wealth he accumulates," read one entry, "but by the trust he honors and the harm he works to repair. Tonight I must choose between the coward who has hidden in these mountains and the man I might yet become, if courage can overcome a lifetime of moral cowardice." Another passage struck even deeper. "I came to this place believing I was seeking solitude, but I was actually seeking absolution without confession, forgiveness without acknowledgement of the harm I had caused. True penance cannot begin until a man stops running from what he has done and starts walking toward what he might yet do to make amends." The words seemed to flow from some deeper part of his consciousness, as if the supernatural events of the day had opened channels to truths he'd kept buried beneath layers of rationalization and self-deception. As he wrote, or found himself writing, Silas began to understand that the choice before him wasn't simply between capture and flight, but between continuing to live as a man, defined by his betrayals, or beginning to live as someone willing to be measured by his attempts at redemption. Outside his cabin window, the green glow from Jasper's grave had grown bright enough to be visible even at this distance, pulsing like a beacon that drew his attention with hypnotic regularity. Each pulse seemed to correspond with the rhythm of his own heartbeat, as if the supernatural phenomenon had somehow synchronized itself with the life force of the man whose choices had set these events in motion. But the glow was changing, becoming more complex as the night deepened. What had begun as simple green light was now revealing patterns within patterns, geometric designs that spiraled outward from the gravesite, creating mandalas of luminescence that seemed to carry messages written in a language older than words. The patterns reminded Silas of geological formations he'd encountered during his career, crystalline structures that revealed the hidden order underlying apparently chaotic natural processes. As he watched the evolving display, Silas began to perceive something that made his scientific mind struggle to accommodate new possibilities. The patterns weren't random supernatural manifestations. They were maps, detailed surveys of underground mineral deposits that stretched throughout the entire Dry Creek region. The green light was revealing the same kind of geological information that had made his professional reputation, but displayed through means that transcended anything he'd learned during his formal education. The implications struck him with the force of revelation. The supernatural forces that had brought Thomas's compass and journal to his attention weren't simply seeking personal justice. They were revealing the broader pattern of exploitation that had shaped the entire territorial mining industry. Every green spiral, every luminous line, corresponded to mineral deposits that powerful interests had identified and claimed through the same methods that had destroyed Whitmore Valley. Dry Creek itself, along with dozens of other small communities scattered across the Colorado Territory, had been marked for eventual destruction by mining operations that would proceed exactly as they had in Whitmore Valley, with expert geological testimony providing the legal justification for displacing families who'd built their lives on land that contained wealth they'd never suspected. But knowledge, Silas was beginning to understand, carried the obligation to act. The supernatural revelation spreading across the landscape below his cabin wasn't just exposing past crimes, it was warning of future ones, providing information that could be used to protect communities that didn't yet know they'd been targeted for destruction. The journal continued to fill with entries that seemed to write themselves, each one carrying insights that pushed Silas toward decisions he'd never imagined himself capable of making. "The knowledge I gained through betrayal can become a weapon for protection," read one passage. "The expertise I use to destroy communities can be turned towards saving them, if I'm willing to sacrifice the safety that silence has provided." Another entry was even more direct. "Tomorrow I can choose to run, preserving my freedom while others suffer the same fate I helped to inflict on Thomas and his neighbors. Or I can choose to stay, to tell the complete truth about how the mining industry operates, and to use whatever time remains to me in working to prevent the destruction of communities that don't yet know they're in danger." As midnight approached, bringing with it the day when territorial authorities would arrive to arrest him, Silas found himself drafting a different kind of document, a comprehensive confession that detailed not just his role in the destruction of Whitmore Valley, but his knowledge of the broader pattern of exploitation that continued to threaten communities across the territory. The confession named names, revealed methods, and provided geological data that could be used to identify every community that had been secretly surveyed for future mining operations. It was a document that would destroy any chance he might have of escaping justice, but it was also a document that could save hundreds of families from experiencing the same devastation that had claimed Thomas Whitmore's community. With each page he wrote, Silas felt something changing within himself, not the dramatic transformation that stories often described, but the quieter shift that occurred when a man finally stopped, fighting against the current of his own conscience and allowed himself to be carried toward the person he'd always had the potential to become. The green light from Jasper's grave pulsed brighter as he worked, as if approving of his choice to transform knowledge gained through betrayal into wisdom that might prevent future betrayals. The patterns it revealed continued to evolve throughout the night, creating a living map of mineral wealth that Silas translated into warnings for communities that didn't yet know they were in danger. By dawn, he had filled nearly 50 pages with information that represented the complete dismantling of his own carefully constructed anonymity and safety. The confession would expose him not just as the man who'd betrayed Thomas Whitmore, but as someone who possessed intimate knowledge of a conspiracy that stretched from territorial capitals to corporate boardrooms in Denver and beyond. As the first light of morning touched the peaks around Dry Creek, Silas sealed the confession in an oiled leather pouch and secured it inside his coat. The territorial authorities would find him waiting when they arrived, ready to surrender himself and to provide testimony that would destroy his own freedom while potentially saving countless others from the same fate that had claimed the residents of Whitmore Valley. But first, there was one final journey he needed to make, back to Jasper's grave, where the supernatural phenomena that had forced him to confront his past might finally be ready to release their hold on the present. The green light that had started this entire reckoning was calling him toward a final confrontation with the choices that would define whatever remained of his life as he walked down the mountain trail one last time as a free man. Silas carried with him the weight of complete truth and the possibility of redemption that could only begin when a man stopped running from what he had done and started walking toward what he might yet accomplish in whatever time remained. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Silas made his way down the familiar trail to the cemetery for what he knew would be the last time as a free man. Behind him, smoke no longer rose from his cabin's chimney. He'd allowed the fire to die during the night, symbolically ending the chapter of his life that had been built on denial and isolation. Ahead lay the green glow that had started his journey toward truth, now pulsing with an intensity that seemed to welcome his approach. The cemetery appeared transformed in the early light, no longer the peaceful resting place he'd visited weekly for months, but something that bridged the gap between the world of the living and the realm where justice transcended earthly limitations. Jasper's grave had become the center of a phenomenon that defied every law of nature Silas understood. Its impossible green growth now covering nearly half the cemetery and creating patterns of such geometric complexity that they seemed to encode messages in a language older than human speech. But as he approached the gravesite, Silas realized he wasn't alone. Sheriff Martha Hayes stood near the eastern edge of the cemetery, her face reflecting the mixture of wonder and professional concern that supernatural events brought to practical minds. Beside her, Doc Henley and Jimmy Crawford watched the unfolding phenomenon with expressions that ranged from scientific curiosity to spiritual awe. "Silas?" Martha called as he drew near, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. "We need to talk." But before Silas could respond, the green light pulsing from Jasper's grave suddenly intensified, creating a luminous column that rose 30 feet into the morning sky. Within that column, shapes began to form, not the translucent spirits he'd encountered at the pyramid, but solid, recognizable figures that cast their own shadows and seemed to possess the full substance of living beings. Thomas Whitmore materialized first, appearing exactly as he had in life, but carrying an authority that transcended mortal limitations. Behind him came others, Sarah Whitmore and their children, neighbors from the destroyed valley, even some of the families from other mining operations that Silas's expert testimony had helped to devastate. They arranged themselves around Jasper's grave with the solemnity of a court convening to render final judgment. Jimmy Crawford stumbled backward, his young mind struggling to process what his eyes were witnessing. "Sheriff, are you seeing this?" "Are they really real enough?" Martha replied, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon before she realized the futility of such preparation. "Real enough to cast shadows and leave footprints in the snow." Doc Henley, whose 70 years had taught him to accept mysteries that defied rational explanation, stepped closer to the supernatural gathering with the careful respect that mountain folk traditionally showed to forces beyond their understanding. "Silas, I think these folks have something to say to you." Thomas stepped forward from the assembled spirits, his presence so solid and immediate that Silas could see individual details. The calloused hands that spoke of honest labor, the eyes that held the weight of absolute truth, the expression of a man who'd found purpose in death that had been denied him in life. "You came back," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the clarity of mountain air. "I wondered if the knowledge of what tomorrow brings would drive you to flight, or if you'd finally found the courage to face what you've done." Silas reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch containing his confession, holding it out toward Thomas with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. "I wrote it all down. Everything I did, everything I know about the mining operations, every community that's been marked for destruction. It's all here." Thomas accepted the pouch with the solemnity of a judge receiving evidence, but he didn't open it. "The words are important, but they're not enough. Writing the truth in private is different from speaking it before witnesses who can carry that truth into the world." Around the cemetery, more figures began to appear, not spirits of the dead, but living people emerging from the forest that surrounded the burial ground. Silas recognized Samuel Morrison first, but behind him came others whose presence filled him with growing recognition and dread. These were officials from the territorial government, representatives of the federal agencies that oversaw mining operations, and most troubling of all, executives from Consolidated Mining Corporation itself. Dr. Silas Boone, called a tall man in an expensive coat who seemed to command the attention of the other officials. "I'm Territorial Marshal James Henshaw, and I have warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and complicity in the wrongful deaths that resulted from the mining operations you helped to facilitate." But even as Marshal Henshaw spoke, his attention was drawn to the supernatural gathering around Jasper's grave. The spirits of the displaced and destroyed had arranged themselves in a formation that seemed designed for testimony, creating a natural amphitheater where truth could be spoken and witnessed by both the living and the dead. Thomas turned to address the assembled officials, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral conviction. "These charges speak to crimes against territorial law, but the true scope of this man's actions extends far beyond what any earthly court can address. If you would understand the full pattern of exploitation that has shaped mining operations across this territory, you must hear testimony from those who paid the ultimate price for corporate greed." Marshal Henshaw, a man whose career in territorial law enforcement had taught him to deal with unusual circumstances, stepped forward with the careful respect of someone who recognized that extraordinary events required extraordinary procedures. "I'm willing to hear whatever testimony these circumstances make possible, provided it can be substantiated by evidence that will stand up in territorial court." Sarah Whitmore moved to stand beside her husband, her presence radiating the particular grief of a woman who'd lost not just her spouse, but her entire way of life. "The evidence is written in the destroyed communities across 3 territories, Marshal. The evidence is in the families scattered to the wind, the children who died in exile, the graves that mark the true cost of mining operations that were justified by expert testimony that this man provided." As Sarah spoke, The green light pulsing from Jasper's grave began to create new patterns, maps that showed the locations of destroyed communities, geological surveys that revealed the scope of mineral wealth that had motivated the displacement of entire populations, correspondence that proved the systematic nature of the exploitation. Morrison stepped forward from among the territorial officials, producing his leather portfolio and spreading documents across a flat stone that seemed to have been placed for precisely this purpose. "Marshal, I have 15 years of research that documents Dr. Boone's role in mining operations that destroyed communities from Montana to New Mexico. The pattern is clear, systematic, and ongoing. But it was Silas himself who provided the testimony that would prove most damaging and most redemptive. Standing before the assembled officials and supernatural witnesses, he began to speak with the clarity that comes when a man finally stops protecting himself and starts protecting others. "Everything they're saying is true," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I provided geological expertise to mining operations that I knew would destroy the communities that had hired me to conduct honest surveys. I took payment for betraying the trust of people who welcomed me into their homes and treated me as a friend." The confession poured out of him like water released from a broken dam, carrying with it decades of accumulated guilt and carefully maintained denial. He detailed the systematic process by which mining corporations identified targets for expansion, the legal mechanisms they used to override property rights, and his own role in providing the technical justification that made such operations possible. As Silas continued his confession, the green light emanating from Jasper's grave began to respond to his words, creating visual representations of the crimes he described. Maps appeared in the luminous air above the cemetery, showing the locations of destroyed communities and the mineral wealth that had motivated their destruction. Names and dates materialized in letters of living light, creating a record that no earthly court could dismiss as hearsay or fabrication. "The Clearwater Canyon operation displaced 47 families," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger as the burden of secrecy lifted from his shoulders. "I knew the mining process would poison their water sources within 6 months, but I certified the environmental impact as minimal in exchange for a partnership agreement worth $50,000. Marshal Henshaw and his colleagues watched in fascination as the supernatural display confirmed each detail of Silas's testimony with precision that exceeded any documentation they'd ever encountered. The spirits of the displaced families materialized briefly as each operation was described, adding their silent witness to the growing catalogue of systematic exploitation. But it was when Silas began describing the ongoing conspiracy that his confession took on truly explosive significance. "There are currently 16 communities across the Colorado Territory that have been secretly surveyed for future mining operations," he said, producing a hand-drawn map from his confession. "Consolidated Mining has identified mineral deposits worth an estimated $2 million beneath land that's currently occupied by farming and ranching families who have no idea their homes have been marked for destruction." The territorial officials exchanged glances that mixed professional interest with growing alarm. If Silas's information proved accurate, they were looking at the largest case of territorial fraud in Colorado's history, a conspiracy that involved not just mining corporations but territorial officials who'd been paid to facilitate the legal mechanisms that made such operations possible. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his presence radiating the authority of absolute moral truth. "Dr. Boone speaks truly, but his words only touch the surface of the corruption that has infected territorial governance. There are officials in this very gathering who have taken payment to ensure that mineral rights claims receive favorable consideration, regardless of their impact on existing communities." The accusation sent a visible shock through the assembled officials, several of whom began studying their colleagues with newly suspicious eyes. Marshal Henshaw, whose reputation for integrity had made him the territorial government's choice for handling sensitive investigations, stepped closer to Thomas with the careful respect of a lawman who understood that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary methods of gathering evidence. Can you provide specific names and documentation to support these charges? Henshaw asked, his voice carrying the professional neutrality that marked serious legal proceedings. In response, Thomas gestured toward the green light that continued to pulse around Jasper's grave. The supernatural display immediately began creating new patterns, correspondence between territorial officials and mining corporations, records of payments made to influence legal decisions, documents that proved the systematic nature of the corruption that had made operations, like Whitmore Valley possible one, of the territorial officials, a portly man whose expensive clothing suggested wealth beyond what his government salary should provide, began backing toward the forest edge with the nervous movements of someone contemplating flight. But the spirits of the destroyed communities seemed to anticipate his intention, forming a barrier that prevented his departure while maintaining the solemn dignity of a court in session. Territorial Commissioner Harold Brennan, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment, received $15,000 in gold to expedite mineral rights claims that displaced the Morrison family ranch in southeastern Colorado. The Morrison children died of exposure during their forced relocation in the winter of 1879. Brennan's face went white as supernatural forces provided documentation that proved every detail of Thomas's accusation. Letters in his own handwriting appeared in the luminous air above the cemetery, along with bank records that showed the precise dates and amounts of payments he'd received from Consolidated. Mining Marshal Henshaw turned to his deputies with the grim expression of a man who understood that the investigation he'd come to conduct had suddenly expanded beyond anything he'd prepared for. Place Commissioner Brennan under arrest on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and complicity in wrongful death. We'll need to secure all the documentation these circumstances are providing, but even as the immediate arrests began, the supernatural tribunal was expanding its scope to encompass the full breadth of territorial mining corruption. More spirits materialized around the cemetery, not just families from destroyed communities, but territorial officials who died under suspicious circumstances, witnesses who'd been silenced before they could testify, children whose deaths could be traced directly to the displacement caused by mining operations. Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, her presence radiating the particular authority of maternal grief transformed into moral purpose. Marshal, the crimes you're investigating extend beyond territorial boundaries. Federal officials in Washington have received payments to ensure that territorial mining legislation favors corporate interests over individual property rights. The scope of the conspiracy that was being revealed through supernatural testimony began to overwhelm even the experienced federal officials who'd accompanied Marshal Henshaw. They were looking at corruption that reached from local territorial commissioners to federal senators, involving millions of dollars in bribes and payoffs that had shaped mining policy across the entire western frontier. Morrison stepped forward from among the federal officials, his face reflecting the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 15 years gathering evidence that was finally being corroborated by sources beyond any earthly challenge. Marshal, I have documentation in Denver that supports everything these witnesses are revealing. We're looking at the largest case of systematic corruption in territorial history, but it was Silas who provided the testimony that would prove most crucial to bringing the full conspiracy to light. Standing before the assembled officials and supernatural witnesses, he began naming names and revealing details that no investigation could have. Uncovered through conventional means, Senator Malcolm Caldwell received $40,000 to ensure that federal mining legislation included loopholes that allowed corporations to override territorial property rights, Silas said, his confession now flowing with the force of a man who decided to reveal everything he knew, regardless of the consequences to himself. As each name was spoken, The supernatural display provided corroborating evidence, correspondence, financial records, testimonials from victims who'd been silenced by earthly means but could finally speak through the extraordinary circumstances that had transformed Jasper's grave into a tribunal for absolute justice. The climax reached its peak when Thomas Whitmore raised his hand for silence, his presence commanding the attention of every witness, living and dead, who'd gathered for this unprecedented reckoning. "The debt that brought us to this place has been acknowledged," Thomas said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment rendered. "Dr. Silas Boone has chosen truth over safety, justice over self-preservation. The knowledge he gained through betrayal will now serve to protect the communities that remain under threat." As Thomas spoke, the green light around Jasper's grave began to fade, its purpose finally fulfilled. The spirits of the displaced and destroyed offered final words of acknowledgement to the man who'd betrayed them, then disappeared into the mountain air like morning mist touched by sunlight. But the earthly consequences of the supernatural revelation were just beginning. Marshal Henshaw found himself in possession of evidence that would reshape territorial justice and federal mining policy, while Silas faced the choice between fleeing from consequences that no longer seemed as terrible as the guilt he'd carried for over 2 decades. The climax of his personal reckoning had been reached, but the resolution of what it meant for his remaining years still lay ahead. 5 years later, the mountain cemetery above Dry Creek had returned to the peaceful solitude that marked most high country burial grounds. The green grass that had sparked such extraordinary events now grew in natural cycles, responding to seasons and weather like any ordinary vegetation. Jasper's grave bore a simple marker, noting the faithful companion who'd served as catalyst for revelations that had reshaped territorial justice. But the supernatural manifestations that had transformed the site into a tribunal for absolute truth had faded into memory and legend. Silas Boone, he'd reclaimed his real name during the legal proceedings that followed his confession, stood beside that grave on a crisp autumn morning, his weathered hands holding a letter that had arrived from Washington the previous week. At 73, his face bore the particular peace that comes to men who've stopped running from themselves and learned to find purpose in the time that remains. The letter bore the seal of the Department of Interior and contained news that would have seemed impossible during his years of hidden guilt. His testimony and the supernatural evidence that had corroborated it had led to the largest federal investigation of territorial corruption in American history. 17 territorial officials had been convicted and imprisoned, while 3 federal senators had resigned in disgrace. More importantly, legislation had been passed that required mining corporations to obtain consent from existing landowners before filing mineral rights claims, effectively ending the systematic displacement of farming and ranching communities. But the letter contained more personal news as well. The federal government, in recognition of his cooperation and the value of his ongoing testimony, had granted him a full pardon for his role in the mining operations. His mountain cabin and the surrounding land had been deeded to him legally, free of the fraudulent claims that had clouded his ownership for over 2 decades. Sheriff Martha Hayes approached through the cemetery's eastern gate, her stride reflecting the confidence of someone who'd spent 5 years watching justice work its way through legal channels with the thoroughness that supernatural intervention had made possible. At 59, she'd become something of a legend in territorial law enforcement, known for her role in exposing the corruption that had shaped mining policy across the western frontier. "Morning, Silas," she called, her voice carrying the warmth that had replaced the professional wariness she'd once shown toward the mysterious mountain man. "Got a visitor down in town who's asking to see you. Says his name's David Morrison, and he's Samuel's younger brother." Silas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, his expression reflecting the mixture of anticipation and concern that came with news of family connections to his past. Samuel Morrison had become an unlikely ally during the federal investigation. using his 15 years of research to help prosecutors build cases against the officials and corporations that had destroyed his grandfather's community. But the mention of a younger brother suggested unfinished business that still required resolution. Did he say what he wanted? Silas asked. Though part of him already suspected the answer, Martha's expression carried the gentleness she'd learned to show when delivering news that carried emotional weight. Says he's got something that belongs to you, something his grandfather wanted you to have, but only after the debt had been properly settled. The walk down to Dry Creek took them through landscape that had been transformed by more than just the passage of seasons. The revelation of the planned mining operations had brought federal protection to the entire region, designating it as a territorial preserve where mining would be prohibited indefinitely. Families who'd been secretly marked for displacement had instead found their land values increased by the protection that Silas's confession had made possible. Doc Henley's general store buzzed with the quiet activity that marked autumn, preparations in mountain communities. But the atmosphere was notably different from Silas's early years in Dry Creek, where once he'd been treated with the polite distance reserved for mysterious strangers. He now received the warm greetings accorded to someone who'd proven himself a friend to the community, despite his complicated past. Jimmy Crawford, now 29 and running the store while his grandfather enjoyed a more leisurely retirement, looked up from his ledger with the smile of someone who'd found his purpose in life. "Mr. Boone, your visitor's been waiting in the back room. Grandfather's been keeping him supplied with coffee and conversation." David Morrison proved to be a younger version of his brother Samuel. But where Samuel had carried the focused intensity of someone pursuing justice, David radiated the calm satisfaction of someone who'd seen that justice achieved. He rose from his chair as Silas entered the store's back room, extending a hand in greeting that carried no trace of the hostility Silas might have expected from Thomas Whitmore's family. "Mr. Boone," David said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd thought carefully about this moment. "Samuel asked me to thank you for the courage you showed during the federal investigation. Your testimony saved communities that our grandfather never lived to see, but he would have wanted protected." From a leather satchel beside his chair, David withdrew an object that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. It was Thomas Whitmore's cavalry sword, the one that had been buried with him in the territorial cemetery before his spirit had found its way to the pyramid. Above Dry Creek, the blade gleamed with the particular luster of steel that had been cared for by someone who understood its value, while the brass guard bore an inscription that Silas could read from across the room. Grandfather carried this during his service with the Colorado Volunteers, David explained, offering the sword with the solemnity that military traditions demanded. After his death, it was supposed to be buried with him, but somehow it found its way to Samuel instead. He's carried it for 15 years, waiting for the day when justice would be served and the debt properly settled. Silas accepted the sword with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control, feeling the weight of metal that seemed to carry more than its physical mass. The inscription on the guard read simply, "Thomas Whitmore in service to truth and community." "I don't understand," Silas said, though part of him was beginning to comprehend the deeper meaning behind the gift. "Why would your grandfather want me to have this?" David's expression carried the particular wisdom that comes to men who've learned to see past immediate circumstances toward longer patterns of meaning. "Because a sword can be a weapon of destruction or a tool of protection, depending on the hands that wield it. Grandfather believed that redemption was possible for any man willing to acknowledge his mistakes and work to prevent others from making the same ones." As David spoke, Silas found himself thinking about the 5 years that had passed since his confession in the cemetery. He'd spent that time not in prison, as he'd expected, but traveling throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond, using his geological expertise to help communities identify and protect themselves from the kind of exploitation that had destroyed Whitmore Valley. His reputation had been transformed from that of a man who'd sold his knowledge to the highest bitter to someone who used that same knowledge to protect the powerless from the powerful. The irony wasn't lost on him. The expertise that had once made him wealthy through betrayal now provided him with purpose through protection. Every community he'd helped to safeguard, every family he'd warned about planned mining operations, represented a small payment against the debt he owed to Thomas Whitmore and the countless others whose lives his earlier choices had destroyed. "There's something else," David continued, reaching into his satchel to produce a final item that completed the circle of redemption that had begun with Jasper's impossibly green grave. It was a deed written on territorial government paper and bearing official seals that transferred ownership of the original Whitmore Valley land from Consolidated Mining Corporation back to the Whitmore family. The federal investigation proved that the original mineral rights claims were fraudulent, David explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of justice finally achieved. The valley is being restored as a territorial memorial to the families who were displaced by mining operations. Samuel and I wondered if you might be willing to oversee the restoration, using your geological knowledge to help heal the damage that was done. The offer struck Silas with the force of complete surprise, reframing his understanding of what redemption might look like in practical terms. Instead of simply avoiding further harm, he was being invited to actively repair damage that his earlier choices had caused, to spend his remaining years not just protecting other communities, but healing the specific place where his betrayal had inflicted its greatest wound. Standing in the back room of Doc Henley's store, holding Thomas Whitmore's sword and contemplating an offer that would allow him to spend his final years healing the valley he'd helped to destroy, Silas felt the last weight of 23 years of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. The debt that had followed him across half a continent and through decades of denial had finally been transformed from a burden of shame into an opportunity for meaningful service. Outside the store's windows, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the high country, covering the landscape in the kind of pristine white that suggested new beginnings and fresh possibilities. Somewhere up the mountain, Jasper's grave rested peacefully beneath its blanket of snow, no longer glowing with supernatural light, but retaining the quiet dignity that marked the resting place of a faithful companion whose death had somehow become the catalyst for his master's redemption. The green grass had returned to normal cycles, the spirits had found their rest, and the debt that had haunted both the living and the dead had finally been settled through the simple act of choosing truth over safety. But the most important transformation had been in Silas himself, who'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about using the lessons of that past to create a better future for others. As autumn snow continued to fall on Dry Creek and the mountains beyond, Silas Boone began planning for a return to Whitmore Valley, not as the man who'd helped to destroy it, but as someone finally worthy of the trust that Thomas Whitmore had placed in him so many years ago.